Memories of Grandpa and the Bonds of Marriage. Chapter 1, The Daily Grind. Tom sighed as he poured himself a cup of coffee, the aroma of freshly baked bread filling the kitchen. His wife, Sarah, bustled around in her crisp business suit, preparing to leave for another day at her startup. "I'm heading out, Tom. Breakfast is ready on the table," Sarah called out, her voice tinged with a hint of impatience. Tom grunted in response, "I can make my own breakfast, you know." Sarah paused at the door, her hand on the knob. "I'm eating too, so it's no extra effort," she replied, her tone slightly clipped. Without waiting for a response, she left, the door closing with a resounding thud behind her. Tom exhaled heavily, muttering under his breath, "Can't compete with the career woman, can I?" He knew it was a petty thought, but he couldn't help it. At 29, Tom Williams worked as a sales representative for a large household goods company, specializing in adult diapers. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had started in the baby diaper division, but with declining birth rates, the company had shifted focus to the growing elderly care market. He met Sarah at a company party years ago when she worked in the advertising department. Her talent had been quickly recognized, and she had climbed the corporate ladder at an impressive pace. Last year, she and a few colleagues had launched their own startup, with Sarah as the CEO. Despite her busy schedule, Sarah managed to keep their home running smoothly, cooking healthy meals and keeping everything in perfect order. Tom couldn't find fault with anything she did, and that irritated him even more. Chapter 2, The Call. It was on a particularly frustrating day that Tom received a call from his mother. "Tom, honey, it's about Grandpa Joe. He's not doing too well," his mother's voice crackled over the phone. "I go check on him myself, but my back's acting up again. Could you maybe go stay with him for a while?" Tom's grandfather lived on the outskirts of town, about an hour's drive away. As he considered his mother's request, an idea began to form. "You know what, Mom? I think I'll do just that. I'll see if I can work remotely from Grandpa's place for a while." His mother's relief was palpable. "Oh, Tom, that would be wonderful. Thank you, sweetheart." After hanging up, Tom approached Sarah with his plan. Her response was lukewarm at best. "Oh, all right. If you think that's best," she said, barely looking up from her laptop. The next day, Tom spoke with his boss, who surprised him with an unexpected offer. "You know, we've been looking to expand our reach in that area. How about we make this an official assignment? You can work on new client acquisition while you're there." Tom jumped at the opportunity. "That would be great, sir. Thank you." As he packed his bags, Tom felt a mix of guilt and anticipation. He was leaving his wife behind, but he couldn't deny the relief he felt at the prospect of some time away from their increasingly tense household. Chapter 3, Grandpa Joe's House. A week later, Tom pulled up to his grandfather's modest ranch-style house. As he lugged his suitcase up the front path, the door swung open. Well, look who's here. Come to check if I'm ready to kick the bucket?" Grandpa Joe's gravelly voice was filled with mirth despite his words. Tom chuckled. "Come on, Gramps. Can't a guy visit his favorite grandpa without ulterior motives?" "Favorite, huh? I'm your only grandpa, you rascal," Joe retorted, ushering Tom inside. The house was just as Tom remembered, a bit cluttered, but warm and inviting. Photos lined the walls, telling the story of a life well lived. As evening fell, Tom and Joe settled into a comfortable routine. They sat on the porch, cold beers in hand, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues. "So, tell me about this wife of yours," Joe prodded gently. "Sarah, right? How are things going?" Tom took a long swig of his beer before responding. "She's perfect, Gramps. Too perfect, maybe. Successful career, keeps the house spotless, cooks healthy meals. I can't find a single thing to complain about." Joe raised an eyebrow. "Sounds terrible," he deadpanned. Tom laughed despite himself. I know. I sound like an ungrateful jerk. It's just, I feel like I'm constantly falling short. She's this high-powered CEO and I'm just me." Joe nodded thoughtfully. "You know, Tom, marriage isn't about competing. It's about complementing each other. But tell me, do you love her?" The question caught Tom off guard. Of course I do. I think." "You think?" Joe pressed. Tom fell silent, contemplating the question. Did he love Sarah? He certainly had when they first got married. But now, he wasn't so sure anymore. Chapter 4, A Story from the Past. As the days passed, Tom fell into a comfortable routine. He'd work during the day making calls and visiting local care homes, then spend the evenings with his grandfather. They'd cook simple meals together, nothing like Sarah's gourmet health food, and share a drink or two as they talked. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Joe suddenly stood up and shuffled to the bookshelf. He pulled out an old photo album and brought it back to his armchair. "Want to see something interesting?" Joe asked, a twinkle in his eye. Tom leaned forward, curious. Joe flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for, a black and white photograph of a young man standing next to a beautiful young woman. Is that you, Gramps? Tom asked, peering at the photo. But that's not Grandma Betty. Joe smiled, a hint of sadness in his eyes. No, it's not. This is Beatrice. B, we called her. Tom looked up, surprised. He'd never heard his grandfather mention this woman before. Joe began his tale. This was taken in the summer of 1955. I was 17 and B was 16. We lived in the same neighborhood. Her family's farm was just down the road from ours. As Joe spoke, Tom could almost see the scene unfolding before him, two young lovers in a simpler time, their whole lives ahead of them. B was something special, Joe continued. Smart as a whip, kind to everyone she met. And boy could she make me laugh. We'd spend hours together talking about everything and nothing. I thought we'd be together forever. What happened? Tom asked softly. Joe's face grew somber. Life happened, I suppose. B.A.'s family wasn't well off, and when a wealthy businessman from the city took an interest in her, her parents saw it as an opportunity they couldn't pass up. She was engaged by the end of that summer. Tom felt a pang in his chest for his grandfather's long-ago heartbreak. Did you try to stop it? Joe shook his head. What could I do? I was just a poor farm boy with nothing to offer but my heart. B cried when she told me and I cried too. But in those days you didn't go against your parents' wishes. She left and that was that. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the story hanging between them. Finally Tom spoke up. Is that why you never talked about her before? Joe smiled wryly. Well, your Grandma Betty was a wonderful woman. I loved her dearly and we had a good life together. But B, she was my first love. You never really forget that. As Tom looked at the photograph, he couldn't help but draw parallels to his own life. He thought about Sarah, about the excitement and passion they'd shared in the beginning. When had things started to change? You know, Tom, Joe said, interrupting his thoughts, these days you're free to choose who you want to be with. You and Sarah chose each other. But choice isn't just something you make once, it's something you make every day. You choose to love, to understand, to forgive. That's what makes a marriage work. Tom nodded, letting his grandfather's words sink in. He had a lot to think about. Chapter 5. An unexpected encounter. As the weeks passed, Tom found himself settling into a rhythm. He visited local nursing homes and assisted living facilities, pitching his company's products. It was a far cry from Sarah's high-powered startup world, but Tom found he enjoyed the work more than he had back in the city. One afternoon he was wrapping up a sales pitch at Sunnyside Care Home when he heard a commotion in the hallway. Oh Johnny, there you are. I've been looking all over for you. Tom turned to see an elderly woman in a wheelchair, her white hair neatly coiffed, smiling broadly at him. A nurse hurried up behind her. I'm sorry, sir, the nurse said to Tom. Mrs. Anderson gets a bit confused sometimes. Come on, Beatrice, let's go back to your room. Tom froze. Did you say Beatrice? The nurse nodded. Yes, Beatrice Anderson. She has advanced dementia, I'm afraid. Sometimes she thinks she sees people from her past. Tom's mind was racing. Could it be? He looked at the elderly woman more closely. Despite the wrinkles and the white hair, he could see traces of the young woman from his grandfather's photograph. Mrs. Anderson, he said gently, kneeling down beside her wheelchair. Do you remember a man named Joe? Joseph Williams? Beatrice's eyes lit up. Joe. Oh my dear Joe. We danced at the summer festival, remember? The fireflies were all around us, and you wore that silly hat your mother made you wear. Tom felt a lump form in his throat. This was his grandfather's B. Is there any way I could speak with Mrs. Anderson's family? Tom asked the nurse. The nurse hesitated. We're not supposed to give out that information, but her daughter is actually due for a visit this afternoon. If you'd like to wait, I'm sure she wouldn't mind speaking with you. Tom nodded gratefully. He had some calls to make. Chapter 6. Reuniting the Past. An hour later, Tom sat in the care home's visiting area, his heart pounding. He'd called his grandfather and, after some persuasion, convinced him to make the drive over. Now he waited anxiously for both Joe and Beatrice's daughter to arrive. Joe arrived first, looking confused and a bit annoyed. All right, Tom, what's this all about? You were mighty cryptic on the phone. Before Tom could respond, a woman in her early 60s walked in. She looked around uncertainly before approaching them. Excuse me, are you the gentleman who wanted to speak with me? I'm Emily Anderson, Beatrice's daughter. Tom stood up, extending his hand. Yes, thank you for meeting with me. I'm Tom Williams and this is my grandfather, Joe Williams. Emily's eyes widened as she looked at Joe. Williams? My mother used to mention that name sometimes when her memory was better. She'd talk about a boy named Joe from her hometown. Joe, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. B? You're B's daughter? Emily nodded, a mix of emotions playing across her face. Yes, I am. Did you know my mother? Joe's voice was thick with emotion as he replied, We were close once upon a time. A long time ago. Tom pulled out his phone, bringing up the photo he'd taken of his grandfather's old photograph. He showed it to Emily. Is this your mother? Emily gasped. Yes, that's her when she was young. And is that? She looked up at Joe, realization dawning in her eyes. Joe nodded, a sad smile on his face. That's me back in 55. Emily's eyes filled with tears. All these years, whenever Mom would have a moment of clarity, she'd talk about a boy named Joe. About dancing at a festival, about fireflies and stolen kisses. I always thought it was just a fantasy her mind had created. But it was real, wasn't it? Joe nodded, his own eyes glistening. It was real. Tom cleared his throat. Mrs. Anderson Beatrice is here in this facility. Would you like to see her, Gramps? Joe hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Yes, I think I would. They made their way to Beatrice's room, Emily and the nurse leading the way. As they entered, Beatrice looked up from her chair by the window. Her eyes, clouded with confusion moments before, suddenly cleared as they landed on Joe. Joe, she said, her voice quavering. Is it really you? Joe stepped forward, taking Beatrice's frail hand in his. It's me, B. It's been a while, hasn't it? Beatrice smiled, tears spilling down her cheeks. Oh, Joe, I've missed you so. Did you bring your fiddle? Will you play for me while I dance? Joe chuckled softly, playing along with her memory. Of course, B. Anything for you. As Tom watched his grandfather and Beatrice reconnect, lost in a world of shared memories, he felt a profound sense of the passage of time, of loves lost and found. He thought about Sarah, about the love they had shared and the distance that had grown between them. In that moment, Tom knew what he had to do. Chapter 7, Coming Home. The drive back to his grandfather's house was quiet, both men lost in their thoughts. As they pulled into the driveway, Joe finally spoke. Thank you, Tom. For today. For everything. Tom smiled. I'm glad I could do this for you, Gramps. Joe patted Tom's hand. You know, seeing B today, it reminded me of something important. Love, real love, it doesn't just disappear. It might change, it might evolve, but it's always there, underneath everything else. Tom nodded, thinking about Sarah. But you know what else? Joe continued. It's not enough to just love someone. You've got to choose them every single day. Choose to be kind, to be patient, to forgive. That's what makes a marriage work. As Tom helped his grandfather inside, he knew what he had to do. He pulled out his phone and dialed Sarah's number. Hey, he said when she picked up. I'm coming home. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Is everything okay? Is your grandfather all right? Yeah, everything's fine. I need to see you. We need to talk. Another pause. Okay, Sarah said, her voice soft. I'll be here. The next morning, after saying goodbye to his grandfather, Tom hit the road. As he drove, he thought about everything that had happened over the past few weeks. He thought about his grandfather and Beatrice, about lost opportunities and second chances. Most of all, he thought about Sarah. About her drive, her ambition, her kindness. About how, in his insecurity, he had pushed her away instead of appreciating her strengths. As he pulled into their driveway, Tom saw Sarah waiting on the porch. She looked tired, worry etched on her face. He got out of the car and walked towards her, his heart pounding. Sarah? He began, but she cut him off. Tom, I'm sorry, she blurted out. I know I've been distant, always wrapped up in work. I didn't know how to balance everything, and I think I lost sight of what's really important. Tom felt a weight lift from his chest. He reached out and took Sarah's hands in his. No, I'm sorry. I've been so caught up in my own insecurities that I forgot to appreciate you. To choose you every day. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Choose me? Tom nodded, thinking of his grandfather's words. Yeah. To choose to love you, to support you, to be patient and kind. To forgive and to ask for forgiveness. That's what I want to do, Sarah. Every single day. Sarah threw her arms around Tom, holding him tight. I choose you too, Tom. Always. As they stood there on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms, Tom felt a sense of peace wash over him. It wasn't going to be easy, he knew that. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope for their future together. Chapter 8. A New Beginning. In the weeks that followed, Tom and Sarah worked on rebuilding their relationship. They set aside time each evening to really talk about their days, their hopes, and their fears. Tom shared the story of his grandfather and Beatrice, and Sarah listened with tears in her eyes. "I can't imagine losing you like that," she said, squeezing Tom's hand. "I'm so glad we have this chance to make things right." Tom nodded, thinking of the missed opportunity his grandfather had experienced. "Me too. I think Gramps' story made me realize how precious what we have is. We can't take it for granted." They made changes in their daily lives too. Sarah cut back on her work hours, delegating more to her team. She was surprised to find that not only did the company continue to thrive, but her employees seemed more engaged and productive. Tom, inspired by his time working in his grandfather's town, proposed a new initiative at work to focus on smaller rural markets. His boss was impressed with the idea, and soon Tom found himself leading a new team. But more importantly, they made time for each other. They instituted a weekly date night, trying new restaurants or just taking walks in the park. They started cooking together, laughing over burnt attempts and celebrating small successes. It wasn't always smooth sailing. There were still arguments and misunderstandings. But now, instead of letting resentment build, they faced their issues head-on, always remembering to choose each other, every day. Chapter 9: Family Ties. A month after Tom's return, they received news that Grandpa Joe had taken a turn for the worse. Without hesitation, Sarah suggested they both go to be with him. "Are you sure?" Tom asked, touched by her offer. "What about your work?" Sarah smiled, cupping Tom's face in her hands. "You're my family, Tom. And that means your family is my family too. Work can wait." They arrived at Joe's house to find him bedridden, but his eyes lit up when he saw them both. Well, he said, his voice weak but still full of humor. "If it isn't the lovebirds. Come to check if I'm ready to kick the bucket yet?" Tom laughed, blinking back tears. "Come on, Gramps. You know you're too stubborn for that." Over the next few days, they took turns sitting with Joe, making sure he was comfortable. Sarah surprised Tom with her gentle care, always making sure Joe had water or adjusting his pillows just right. One evening, as Sarah had stepped out to make some tea, Joe beckoned Tom closer. "You did good, kid," he said, patting Tom's hand. "She's a keeper." Tom nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I know, Gramps. I almost messed it up, but I know now." Joe smiled. "That's the thing about love, Tommy. It's not about finding the perfect person. It's about finding someone who's willing to work through the imperfections with you." A few days later, with Tom and Sarah by his side, Joe peacefully passed away in his sleep. As they sat there, hands clasped tightly together, Tom felt a profound sense of gratitude for the time he'd had with his grandfather, for the lessons he'd learned, and for the woman beside him who had chosen to stand by him through it all. Chapter 10. A year later. Tom stood in the backyard of his and Sarah's new house, flipping burgers on the grill. The sounds of laughter and conversation filled the air as their friends and family milled about, enjoying the warm summer evening. Sarah appeared at his side, slipping an arm around his waist. "Need any help, chef?" Tom grinned, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Nah, I've got it under control. How's everyone doing?" "Great," Sarah replied. "Emily's telling everyone about the memory garden she's planning for the care home. The one dedicated to Beatrice and Joe." Tom nodded, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. After his grandfather's passing, they had stayed in touch with Emily. Together, they had worked on a project to create a special garden at Sunnyside Care Home, a place where residents with dementia could safely enjoy the outdoors and perhaps spark some happy memories. "That's wonderful," Tom said. "Gramps would have loved that." As if on cue, a gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the sweet scent of the roses Sarah had planted in memory of Joe. "You know," Sarah said softly, "I was thinking. Maybe it's time we start thinking about having a family of our own. What do you think?" Tom felt his heart skip a beat. He turned to face Sarah, seeing the love and hope shining in her eyes. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think that sounds perfect." As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms just as they had been a year ago on their porch, Tom marveled at how much had changed. The challenges they had faced, the lessons they had learned, had only made their bond stronger. He thought of his grandfather and Beatrice, of missed opportunities and second chances. He thought of the choice he and Sarah made every day, to love, to forgive, to grow together. And he knew with absolute certainty that whatever the future held, they would face it together. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Tom raised his voice to address their gathered loved ones. "Hey everyone," he called out, wrapping an arm around Sarah's shoulders. "Sarah and I have an announcement to make." The chatter died down as all eyes turned to them. Tom looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. "We're going to have a baby?" The backyard erupted in cheers and congratulations. As their friends and family surged forward to hug them and offer their well wishes, Tom caught Sarah's eye. In that moment, surrounded by love and joy, he saw reflected in her gaze the same certainty he felt in his heart. They had chosen each other and they would continue to do so, every single day for the rest of their lives. And in that choice lay the greatest adventure of all. Epilogue. Years later, Tom sat on the porch of their home, a small photo album in his hands. A little girl with Sarah's eyes and his unruly hair climbed into his lap. "What's that, Daddy?" she asked, pointing at the album. Tom smiled, opening it to reveal the old black and white photograph of his grandfather and Beatrice. "This, sweetheart, is a story about love. About how it can change us, challenge us, and if we're lucky, give us second chances." As he began to tell the tale, Sarah appeared in the doorway, listening with a soft smile on her face. Their eyes met over their daughter's head, a lifetime of love and understanding passing between them in that single glance. And in the gentle evening breeze, if one listened closely, they might just hear the echoes of a long-ago summer night, of young love and fiddle music, of fireflies dancing and promises whispered under a starry sky. A reminder that while life may not always go as planned, love, true love, has a way of finding its path even across the years.